Well, today we're in Psalm 2. Tomorrow will be Psalm 8. So again, I said we're not doing all 150. We'd be here, well, a good half of a year. Maybe not a bad use of time, but not the goal of this devotional kind of walking through the Bible. Psalm 2. This psalm is of a genre called a royal psalm because it was used or is about the kings of Judah in particular, but the kings of God's people. This psalm describes a coronation celebration where there are rebellious forces at work in the surrounding nations. And the psalm is like a challenge or encouragement to those nations to submit to the king of God's people because the king is under the authority of Yahweh. And we see the early church quoting this psalm in Acts 4 in response to the Jewish leaders' hostility to the early church leaders, Peter and John in particular. And it's also quoted in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. So again, I'm going to read the psalm for us, 3 verses at a time this time. Make, again, a quick comment and then just a closing observation. And again, I want to encourage you, it's just 12 verses. Following your engaging with this, read the psalm yourself, just with, again, some of those little background tidbits, and see what thoughts God brings to your mind for you today. Psalm 2. Why are the nations so angry? Why do they waste their time with futile plans? The kings of the earth prepare for battle. The rulers plot together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Let us break their chains, they cry, and free ourselves from slavery to God. The nations, or that the nations even oppose the king, is kind of a surprise here. Like, if you're opposing the king, you're opposing God. I mean, why would you want to oppose, or why would you want to plan something that's going to fail? And so there's this, again, as we'll see, this call for the nations to submit to the king, not because the king is all that. It's because the king is a representative. The king is connected to Yahweh in a very amazing way, as we'll see. Now, again, I do want to make one comment here, and it's not just this psalm. There's other places in Scripture where well, even David himself, who became king, articulated, I'm not going to touch Saul because he's God's anointed. And sometimes that theology gets misplaced or abused even to say that any leader in the church is God's anointed person, and to stand against that person is to stand against God. That is conflating a whole lot of things that are just not accurate. So here again, go think back, original context. Here's a king of God's people, a people who were called to be a priesthood to the nations. They were called to be a light to the nations. And so that's the covenant history era where this psalm falls. Verses 4 and 6. But the one who rules in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then in anger he rebukes them, terrifying them with his fierce fury. For the Lord declares, I have placed my chosen king on the throne in Jerusalem, on my holy mountain. God's not concerned that the nations are getting all rebellious, because what are they going to do? I mean, God's enthroned in heaven. He's untouchable to human ability and power. Sometimes we use this phrase, well, because God is in control. I'd actually like us to retire that phrase. I think it's more biblically accurate and more theologically accurate to say God is sovereign. God is king. And even when rebellion happens, even though there are things that are going to go on against God and to work against his kingdom and against his people and against his purposes, nothing knocks him off the throne. His purposes will still come to fruition. His will be done. But that doesn't mean he controls everything. I worry sometimes when we say God is in control, we may be giving a message to others that opens God up to the challenge. Well, What about the evil in the world? Is God in control of that? He's sovereign over it. That's accurate. In control of it, that could suggest he did it. That's deeply problematic, at least to me. Rebellion against God angers him. Rebellion against the king here in Psalm 2 angers God. Why? Because God has placed the king there for the flourishing of the nation. The nation of Israel was to flourish so that they would be a light to the other nations, and they would go, oh, the God of Israel, that's a God that actually is real and does things and is personal and powerful, not like our gods. This is what's going on in the old covenant. And so to resist the king, for these nations to resist the king of God's people is actually to resist their own rescue, their own salvation, their own invitation to covenant. Verses 7-9, the king proclaims the Lord's decree. The king is a representative of God. The Lord said to me, you are my son, today I've become your father. Only ask, and I will give you the nations as your inheritance, the whole earth as your possession. You will break them with an iron rod and smash them like clay pots. Here's the king saying, this is what God has told me. I'm his son. I'm part of his family. There's an inheritance. This decree refers to the covenant that God made with David, but the kingship, not leaving his lineage. And God expressed that relationship through the image, through the analogy of father-son, not just deity servant. And so all the nations were going to be the king of Israel, the God's kings, God's Messiah's inheritance, because God is sovereign. And the New Testament authors see, well, Jesus is the fulfillment of this. What was a promise? What was an idea, including here in Psalm 2, is fulfilled in Jesus. And here we have the end of the psalm. Now then, you kings, act wisely. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with reverent fear and rejoice with trembling. Submit to God's royal Son, or he will become angry, and you will be destroyed in the midst of all your activities. For his anger flares up in an instant, but what joy for all who take refuge in him. Because of that father-son relationship, the psalmist encourages other nations surrender to the king, not because it's to the king in particular, it's surrendering to God. Because otherwise they would be destroyed. They will find themselves outside when judgment comes. But they can all peoples, all nations are invited to find refuge in Yahweh. And so here's my question I want to just leave us with. Why have a psalm directed to other nations in the collection of songs for God's people? What value is there for us today to be remembering that's good for us to reflect on? I'll leave that thought with you, but I'll leave you this blessing. May the Lord bless you and keep you today. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you. May the Lord be gracious to you. And today, would you know God's peace? God bless.